And greetings. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the Steve Deace Show here, live and on demand on Blaze TV, radio, and podcast with Todd Erzin and Aaron McIntyre. I'm Steve Deace. We're brought to you by our friends over at Relief Factor. If you're waking up every morning contemplating how am I going to deal with that chronic pain that just won't go away, that often manifests as that lingering achiness and soreness and stiffness, and you might just think that's just going to be my lot in life moving forward. It might be. I mean, we get older, we do die. These mortal bodies do not last forever. But chances are, at least about a 70% chance, that we can do something about it, because those are the odds when you do the math. Over 1 million people have tried the 3-week quick start from Relief Factor over the years, and about 70% of them saw such great results in 3 weeks or less. They stuck with the product long term, like Deborah Ann, dealing with severe hip pain, was taking its toll on her every single day. And she turned to Relief Factor, and after just 4 days, she started to notice the pain wasn't there anymore. She summed it up beautifully when she stated, you know what? I just love how I'm feeling. That could be you. No guarantees, but what do you got to lose to try it for 70% odds at just $20? All right. See if you don't see a difference like Deborah Ann in your pain in 3 weeks or less with Relief Factor. Again, go to relieffactor.com. That's relieffactor.com, or call them at 800-4RELIEF. 800-4RELIEF. All right, coming up on today's show, we're going to try it again with Congressman Chip Roy. We think he's going to be able to join us, Todd, at the bottom of the hour.
Indeed.
All right. They're done twisting his arm. They got his vote on the big, beautiful bill, so they're leaving him alone enough to be able to talk to us now, apparently. All right. I do find it fascinating, and I don't know what to make of it. You know, I'm got to wait and see what comes of it. I think it is possible that a little jujitsu is being tried here to try to get a better deal out of the Senate than what came out of the House. I think that's possible because, I mean, especially Bongino at the FBI, the two largest native MAGA platforms in America, probably Charlie and Tucker, wouldn't you say?
Right.
I mean, if they're not 1 and 2, they're 2 in the top 3.
Right.
Okay, right?
For sure.
Well, yesterday, Charlie had on Senator Rick Scott, who is, and we talked about this yesterday. I mean, he was on yesterday saying, hey, I'm a no on this right now. Well, Tucker just had Senator Ron Johnson on his show last night saying the same thing. So I find that fascinating. Okay. So, you know, maybe there's some jujitsu going on where they're thinking maybe we can get more out of the Senate. I don't know. We'll see. We're going to watch what takes place. What we do know, though, is they're done twisting Chip's arm. He thought he got the best deal he could get, so he ended up voting yes, and he's going to join us here at the bottom of the hour. And then next hour, Theology Thursday, we continue on with my favorite chapter in all of Scripture, Romans chapter 8. We're getting closer to the crescendo of that chapter, which is, you know, the spiritual equivalent of a Newt Rockney. Win one for the Gipper, man. Okay, that's kind of the crescendo that this chapter ends on. So we'll get through as much of that next hour as we can, but we're right now going to get through Aaron's rundown of what happened while we were away.
What happened while we were away, brought to you by a blast from the not-too-distant past. This is the end of the montage from February 20th, barely a month into the second Trump administration. A small claims court in New Mexico's Tularosa Basin has issued a universal injunction against the Trump administration's plans to fire Kyle, a blind Galapagos tortoise employed by the federal government to write interagency memos. When asked for comment, Kyle said, quote, "Ribbit, oh wait, that's what a frog says. What does a tortoise say? I don't know. What I do know is that this quote makes about as much sense as the federal government hiring a tortoise and a small claims court judge coming along to save my job. But somehow, this is more believable than a federal judge ordering the president to put web pages about trans stuff back up. But then again, what do I know? I'm a talking tortoise." And that was the montage on February 20th. Fast forward to today, and not only was it prescient, it didn't go far enough. The U.S. Court of International Trade and a 3-judge panel ruled yesterday that President Trump cannot impose most of the tariffs he has on much of the world and must pay back the revenue already collected from those tariffs. This court has allegedly been around for 100 years, but it sounds made up, and now it's quite frankly just making up laws. Trump so far has been mum on the court's decision. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller reacted to the news saying, quote, "We are living under a judicial tyranny. The administration has already appealed." Also yesterday, a U.S. District Court in Massachusetts blocked the Trump administration's ending of parole for thousands of non-citizens. Parole in this case means the Biden administration let these individuals individuals stay in the country for a period of time, and Trump ended that practice. The Boston-based judge says Trump can't do that. FBI Director Kash Patel is doubling down on what he's discovered about Jeffrey Epstein.
But there is a lot of conspiracy theories out there.
There are.
The Epstein thing, you dealt with Maria, you said, as far as you know, he killed himself.
I'm telling you, he killed himself.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio continues to kill it. He announced last night that the Trump administration will, quote unquote, aggressively revoke visas for a segment of Chinese students. Chinese foreign nationals studying in critical fields or those with ties to the Chinese Communist Party will be among the students targeted for removal. DNC Vice Chair David Hogg got by Project Veritas, where he dropped this nugget on undercover video talking about Dr. Jill Biden's chief of staff, Anthony Bernal, and how much power he actually had.
One question for me is how corrupt is the DNC if so many people knew, or few people knew about Biden? Well, the president of the United States.
I mean, I think the fact of the matter is the DNC is always going to be a campaign arm of the president, ultimately. The bigger issue was the inner circle that was around Biden. That's it.
And I can't stress you enough.
Joe Biden's chief of staff. Had an enormous amount of power.
Joe Biden?
Joe Biden's chief of staff.
That was an open secret at the level. I would avoid him. He was scary.
What was his name?
Anthony.
I've never seen him.
Exactly.
What do you mean?
He's just he's like a shadowy, Wizard of Oz type figure. That's what made him so and I knew how he looked, but the general public wouldn't know how this man looked. But he wielded an enormous amount of power, and I can't stress to you how much power he had in the White House.
Apparently, Hogg's assessment of Jill Biden's chief of staff and the influence he enjoyed in the Biden administration is echoed in Joseph Goebbels' new book, Original Sin. Influencer brothers Andrew and Tristan Tate have been charged in Britain with rape and other crimes. The charges were authorized in January of last year, but not publicized. Andrew Tate faces 10 charges related to 3 women that include rape, actual bodily harm, human trafficking, and controlling prostitution for gain. Tristan faces 11 charges related to 1 woman that include rape, human trafficking, and actual bodily harm. And finally, this from the Babylon Bee.
In a move toward government efficiency, representatives in Congress passed a bill today calling for the mandatory printing of barcodes on their foreheads so that lobbyists can quickly scan their prices and self-checkout. The new system is intended to streamline the current process, making it easier to buy a congressman than ever before. The House voted to pass the bipartisan bill almost unanimously. It now goes to the Senate, where it is expected to pass with similar enthusiasm. According to the text of the bill, self-checkout machines will be installed at all Capitol exits to expedite the quick checkout of elected officials. Lobbyists will no longer have to deal with staffers and secretaries to get what they want. They can go directly to the politician of their choice.
You can watch that entire hilarious video on all the Babylon Bee's social channels, and that's what happened while we were away.
I would highly urge watching the whole thing. There's a moment where they bring Thomas Massie in to discuss why he was the only vote against, and then they claim they have technical difficulties as he starts to talk, and they break away. Oh, my. Aaron's Montage brought to you by my new man, Richie. All right, Richie Meets the Rainbow. We still have we're down to 500 copies now and change. 500 and change of our special, one-time only, full-sized, hardcover, autographed by yours truly edition of Richie Meets the Rainbow, a heartwarming tale of childhood enlightenment. If you want to get your copy now while supplies last, and then when they're gone, they're gone. And then we go out to the public next month with the typical softcover edition that I didn't sign. All right, RichieMeetsTheRainbow.com is where you can go. Make sure you get yours while supplies last. RICHIE. RichieMeetsTheRainbow.com is where you can go. Thank you guys so much. There is a real good shot here. We're going to sell this thing out in about 2 weeks. That's incredible. All right, so we got 500 and change left to go, and make sure you get yours while supplies last at RichieMeetsTheRainbow.com, RICHIE. RICHIE for RichieMeetsTheRainbow.com. And also, please don't forget right now, if you use my last name, Deace, as your promo code, you'll watch today's overtime, every day's overtime, all of the exclusive content we do each and every day, not just us, but the entire team here at The Blaze, as a Blaze TV subscriber. And with my last name, Deace, your promo code, it's going to cost you just $8 a month, 26 cents a day. You can't beat it. I've got to believe that me alone is worth 26 cents a day. I have to believe that. I have to. And I know I love me some me, but I got to believe 26 cent I got to believe on the open market. I got to believe if the Blaze cut us loose tomorrow, I've got to believe we could find a deal worth 26 cents a day for this show. Don't you think?
You're plucky. You're a scrapper.
I got to think. All right. Can't beat it. Code DACE for the big discount. Code DACE for the big discount when you go to blazetv.com/DACE. blazetv.com/DACE. All right, let's go to Aaron's montage. Real quick. At this point, how many years is Project Veritas going to get rid of this stuff?
Forever.
I mean, at this point, homo, hetero, you should just assume, okay? You should just assume that if you are a swamp figure in D.C. or the surrounding areas, and someone that is unusually attractive and probably out of your league typically, shows a keen interest in you. Consider this a pro tip, a PSA. All right, PSA for hacks. Hacks are people too. They're made in the likeness and image of God as well, right? Okay. So this is me loving my neighbor as I love myself here. All right. You should just assume at this point, all right, that if someone that is unusually attractive, male or female, suddenly and out of nowhere shows a keen interest in you, at this point, you should just assume it's Project Veritas and one of their honeypots. You should just assume this.
That's not how narcissism works.
Of course it's not. And clearly, there's no shortage of horny people in D.C. and the surrounding area that are anxious to let the freak flag fly and just thought they were swiping right on Tinder or Grindr, and they were really swiping more right than they thought, if you know what I'm saying. Right all the way to Project Veritas and James O'Keefe. Okay? Way right. Far right, in fact. And you're the next smile. You're on Project Veritas's candid camera. I mean, you would just think at this point memos have gone out, warnings have been sent, but there's no shortage of those with loose zippers within DC and the surrounding area, anxious or at least capable of being honeypotted by the fine folks over at Project Veritas. They just never run out of gullables. They just never do. Maybe it'll never happen.
Oh, I don't think it'll ever happen. You just got done talking about liking me some me.
There you go.
Those people like them some them, and
yes, that's true. That's true. So what? That I look like a total dork. Everybody knows I'm cool, I'm famous, you should want to be around me. So It's not unusual that this really hot guy or really hot chick is interested in me. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Because I'm just that cool and well-known and important, right?
Yes.
Yes. I'll give this warning on the Tate brothers again before I get to the central point of what I wanted to talk about here in this opening segment based on Aaron's montage. Again, they have been put on trial. They have not been convicted. They've been accused of many things. I mean, listen, the bottom line is I have no idea what they're guilty of and what they're not. What I do know is they have made a series of beyond heinous statements in their own voice and on their own image that are available for anybody to see at any point in time they want on social media with just even a cursory search. Okay, so let me just say this again. There's all squeeze, no juice here. There's no ROI here. They bring us nothing at all on the right. Nothing. They offer us nothing. They bring us nothing. It's except baggage and considerable baggage, and the potential of a uniquely right-wing Harvey Weinstein, however you want to pronounce it, event. It's just stupid beyond stupid, just completely unnecessary. They offer nothing. At the very least, they are moral degenerates. That's the nicest thing that you could say. They're complete Maquis de Sade level reprobates with biceps. Okay? I mean, if the Maquis de Sade was able to, if creatine existed at the era of the Maquis de Sade, okay, and gold gyms, it would look like the Tate brothers. That's what he would have, instead of some skinny, scrawny, French pig. Okay, so there's no there. There's no value. These aren't Alexander Solzhenitsyn level political prisoners, anything of that nature. They can more. Maybe they are being falsely accused. They can more than afford their own lawyers and adjudicate their cases. Correct. Yes. All right, but how about the court of who's a moral reprobate or not that offers absolutely nothing? And in that court, I'm going to pronounce him guilty, as does anybody with any modicum or shred of integrity and morality. There's nothing to be gained with this tease, this alliance, nothing. There's nothing there. It's just a black hole of nihilistic Bronze Age pervertism. That's all that it is. Now, to the main point of Aaron's montage.
Speaking of black holes.
I said this to my poker buddies, and I have a private text chain where we, I'm on numerous private text chains. There's a lot of us are in this day and age. But one of them is with my poker buddies, and we'll get into stuff about anything, any guy stuff, our families, politics, sports, theology, anything. Okay. And because I do this for a living, a lot of times I'll get asked questions or things, or things will come up in this front to say, hey, do you know anything about this? Right. I got to think at a minimum, I'm in the top 1% of informed in America at a minimum, just by virtue of what I do for a living. Even if I didn't try, right? Even if I didn't grind and have any work ethic, the fact that I have to come up with some cursory level of knowledge to do a 2-hour show like this 240 times a year, given how busy most of America otherwise is, or complacent as you like to say, would at least put me in the top 1% of informed before I even begin to actually apply any singular work ethic to my chosen vocation. Fair?
Yep.
I had no idea what the U.S. International Trade Court of Appeals was. Never heard of it. Had no clue until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon Central Time yesterday. In fact, I thought it was a troll. I didn't think it existed. I thought that there's just no way this exists.
To be fair, that's the way the founders did create this whole thing. A bunch of quasi-government organizations that no one's
NGOs,
ever heard of running the show, so you can go do whatever you want to.
Unlimited power for judges. They were big on that.
Yes.
In fact, in fact, they ended up rethinking the entire revolution and said, if we were just going to replace England with the same system we just rebelled from, then, what a bunch of idiots we are. Let's just, return to England. And that's what they did, right? That's what they did? No, in fact, within about a decade or so, they fought another war with England, in fact. Where the Brits came and burned down the White House, so there's that. All right. Anyway, okay, I had no idea that this court even existed. I had never heard of it. Doing some research, I actually did find they do actually have some statute authority that there is no statute authority. The term universal injunction does not exist anywhere within any constitutional metric framework or any statute level event. And in fact, you're going to have a hard time finding it uttered at any point in American history prior to something like 1965. Did we start, were we a country prior to 1965? Yes, for about 200 years. Okay, right? This, however, actually was given some statute authority. Now, I'm sure the Trump administration will argue that it has exceeded said authority. Let's pray and hope that they argue it successfully as this thing moves on. All right? And again, keep in mind, this is from also someone who has probably done of any form of significant show on the American right. Probably no one has done more shows on judicial supremacy over the course of my career. Literally one of the events that made my career was leading a fight to oust Supreme Court justices in my own state. Okay. And that effort is what had wealthy Christian businessmen come to me and give me the capital to then try to go out and be a national presence. Was the victory that I helped with in that very race. Okay. The one possible exception would be Daniel Horowitz. He would maybe be the only person with any significant platform on the right that has done more on this topic than I have over the last 15 years of my life and career. Okay. I'd never heard of this tribunal. I had never heard of it. Did not know it existed until about 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. And I thought it was a troll, but no, it's real and unspectacular.
It's all part of the plan,
Okay.
Steve.
So rather than go on another expository dissertation on the courts and the rule of law, only because we're going to probably have to do that 7,000 more times. Okay, I want to approach this from a different angle, because I think it ties together what we talked about yesterday, that we are in a generational hole. Right? We just had a must-win election. And the only generation that voted, only one generation voted for the candidate that won. And when you consider that the entire country moved to the right from where it was the previous election that had not happened in 40 years. Reagan, 1980 was the last time it happened. And so even while the entire country is moving to the right from where it was 4 years ago, still only one generation voted for Trump, Gen X, and they voted in mass. He won them by 11 points. By the way, what generation is Elon Musk? Gen X. That generation. Yeah. The generation, again, that when they entered middle school, they were still singing Silent Night and Joy to the World at the public school Christmas spectacular. And by the time they, and then after they graduate, by the time they got to their senior years in high school, all that stuff was gone because it was replaced by winter break. And have you guys heard about how the significant historical contributions homosexuals have made throughout history? We are the generation that has lived through this. All right. Before there was wokeism, there was intersectionality, and before there was intersectionality, there was political correctness. We've lived through all the iterations of this, all right? They fed us political correctness in high school. They fed us intersectionality in college. And then as adults, it's been wokeism. But we've lived through every iteration and every evolution of the spirit of the age, post-sexual revolution. We were the first generation force-fed pornography. And I'm not talking scrounging through dad's Playboy stash in the garage when he's gone to see if you can get a side nipple. I'm talking hardcore, real sex. We were the first generation force-fed this. I doubt that in our generation you will find a kid that went to a government school that by the time he was 12 or 13, already there was nothing left to the imagination for the female anatomy by that point in time in our generation, unless they have a physical disability, frankly. And so it makes sense that it's our generation now that was the most on alert because we're at the tail end of raising our kids. We're launching our kids, and now we're taking a look at the long-term future as our kids are now having kids. That's me. I've launched 2 kids. Now that I'm about to launch the third and final kid, we just had our first grandkid with the hope of many more. I'm right in that wheelhouse. And so the last generation could not be bothered. The last generation en masse, and I know I'm going to get thousands of emails from boomers. It wasn't me. I'm not saying it was you. Did I say your name? No. And did every Gen Xer vote for Trump? So if he won by 11, that means what? Still about 40%, 45% of our generation still voted for communists. Still lived through everything we've lived through and still voted for communism, right? Yes. So holistically, all right, I didn't call you out, but the reality is of the last generation either en masse helped perpetrate the undoing of America, starting with the sexual revolution and the trillions of dollars of debt we now have, or was complacent in allowing it to happen. Didn't actually stop it at the point that didn't dam the river at the source that it could have been dammed. So here we are. And now what we're seeing here is it took an entire generation to get here. It's going to take more than, hey, we elected a disruptor, weapon of mass destruction, a human Moab named Donald Trump, drain the swamp. He is a weapon of mass destruction, man. But this is going to, you got the Japs to quit at Hiroshima and Nagasaki after you spent 3 years forcing them to retreat in bloody island warfare. Like we didn't drop a neutron bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and think, all right, we're done here. We had to break their will first. Then we went to the closing, finishing move, if you look at this in pro wrestling parlance. This last election, man, we just got in this. Dude, ring announcers have been calling for this like steel cage match for like decades. We just didn't even show up. Or we sent a bush, okay? Like a they call those guys tools, or toadies in pro wrestling parlance. They're just there to lose. Controlled opposition is the term maybe we use in the political world. Like the Brooklyn Brawler. If you grew up Gen X watching WW, it was back then it was WWF. Brooklyn Brawler was there. He was just there to lose to Hulk Hogan, Junkyard Dog, and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat every Saturday morning. He was just there to lose. For like 10 minutes, they'd make it look like he could win, and then he was just there to lose every week. That was the Republican Party. Between Reagan and Trump, that was, and except for the 6 months of the contract with America, that was the Republican Party in America. Anybody want to argue with that?
More or less, yeah, that's right.
All right, and we didn't ask for any more, and we often condemned one another if somebody like me stood up and said we should ask for more. We got condemned for that. Well, I mean, Romney's not good. No, actually, Romney's not good enough. And weirdly, almost none of the people that condemned me for saying that 15 years ago have come back to apologize to me 15 years later. Funny how that works.
That checks out.
Yeah, that's how that works a lot, yeah. Well, I'm grifting, of course. Yes. Well, what you're seeing right now as we come to the end of this generation, what you're seeing right now is all the institutions are corrupted and gone and captured. The courts are just one of the most high-profile examples. But essentially, anything we are attempting to do, they find a non-elected means of trying to thwart it. And unfortunately, this current generation is still predisposed to view judges as en masse. Again, not if you're in the boomer generation in this audience, we probably got to talk you out of maybe committing some crimes against judges at this point. Probably fair, okay? Yeah. But outside of audiences like this, okay, en masse again, en masse again, en masse again, en masse. I mean, look at the advent of Christianity. Everybody that founded the Christian church was Jewish, correct? Did most Jews recognize Yeshua as Messiah? No. Most of that generation of Jews rejected Christ as Messiah, correct?
Yes.
But everybody who established the church was a Jew. So were there specific Jews who recognized this is the fulfillment of the way, what they called the way, the Psalms, the Word, the Law, the prophets, the Psalms? Did they recognize this? Everyone who he called to be a disciple, everyone who started the church, were they a Jew?
Yeah.
Yes. But by and large, take a drink. By and large, did that generation of Jews recognize and worship Yeshua as Messiah? No, they rejected him as a generation. Is that a good analogy for the point I'm trying to make?
Sure.
So for the boomer generation outside of audiences like this, en masse, or by and large, they view judges as neutral arbiters. So building the critical mass it will take to resist this is going to take some time. I think the amount of pressure that exists moving forward for the J.D. Vance generation is high. Because what you're finding right now, Congress useless. Media, completely untrustworthy and sold out. And that's when they're not lying to you. The courts just completely captured institutions. Every vestige of government whatsoever, the bureaucracy completely captured and run amok. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
This is all getting exposed right now. So again, it wasn't the older generation, wasn't Trump's generation that voted for him. It was the next generation that did. The expectations that next generation, gentlemen, are going to have. I know I got mocked from this by everybody, by all 180 people that have Gators and DeSantis 28 hashtags in their bios, so I'm going to say it again. Trump is the John the Baptist character here. I'm using that as an archetype. He is the forerunner, okay? I think Jesse Kelly has made this point many times. If you are a communist and you think you cannot stomach what Donald Trump represents, I promise you what will come after him on the right is going to be worse, much worse. And you know what? It's going to have to be. It will have to be. Because all of the institutions that the boomer generation, except for those of you in an audience like this, allowed to be captured and taken over or helped capture and take over, cannot be trusted any longer. The physician cannot heal thyself. Which means what's going to be required from the next generation after Trump, the Vance generation, our generation. Vance is actually a high-end millennial, but there's overlap there between us and them. What will come next will be way more aggressive. I think the governor of Florida has demonstrated a portion of this in the last 5 years because it's going to have to be. Congressman Chip Roy joins us next. I enjoyed it, and I think you will too. And there's nothing wrong with a date night out for a movie with a redemptive story. And that's the speciality of our friends over at Angel Studios. Their latest out right now with Mr. Angel Studios himself, Neil McDonough, called The Last Rodeo, the studio behind the masterpieces King of Kings, at least in my opinion, and Sound of Freedom. This is their latest this action-packed story of a retired rodeo legend who straps it on for one last ride, literally risking his life for his grandson. The movie is about healing broken bonds, facing your past, real courage, sacrificial love. So get your tickets now. It's in theaters now. You'll love this as a date night film. At angel.com/Steve. It would be a good family outing for the movie, for a movie as well. Angel.com/Steve is where you can go to go see The Last Rodeo at angel.com/Steve. We're going to go now and see my good friend Congressman Chip Roy from the state of Texas, where a good amount of the movie The Last Rodeo actually takes place in that state. Good to see you again, Chip. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, Steve. How are you and your wonderful family?
Doing very well, man. Appreciate it. Could be a little better. Could be a lot worse, as Dave Ramsey likes to say. All right. So let's get to, you know what? Let's start there, Chip. I mean, you guys at the Freedom Caucus, some people would say put up a fight. Other people would say it was a negotiation, all right, to get the best deal you could, all right? The big, beautiful bill, would you describe it as could be a little better, could be a lot worse? Is that maybe the way you would describe the end product that you voted for, or would you give it a different description?
I would probably just change your sentence to could be a lot better, could be a lot worse, which means there's kind of a wide range there. Look, I can go through in detail. I'll give you my quick summary, and we can dive into it as deeply as you want to or not. The short version is, when we started this process, we knew it was going to be really difficult to move your traditional Republicans in the Congress, in the House and the Senate, with such thin majorities, to get them to the place of cutting it all, right? Because it's just not in their DNA to do it. So we started the process several months ago of setting up a framework to demand that if you're going to go push for the extension of the tax cuts, which I support generally, and additional tax cuts, which I support generally, we need spending cuts to align with it so that we have deficit reduction. And we're accepting, by the way, dynamic scoring. That is that when you do tax cuts and you do regulatory policy, then we'll have economic growth and we'll get tax revenue out of that. So that was the framework that we adopted. But there were important key elements, which is reforming Medicaid to make sure that we don't, cement Obamacare and that we stop the ridiculous overpayment of the able-bodied over the vulnerable. And we wanted to fix the Inflation Reduction Act to end the subsidies of unreliable energy so that we could save our country and get the economy going in the right direction. So those were our core elements, and there were dozens of others: Planned Parenthood, gun issues, and other stuff. So what we produced through nonstop negotiation for months, like literally last week, Steve, I woke up Tuesday morning at 6:30 and I didn't go to sleep until Friday morning at 1 a.m. Because we were working around the clock. And what we produced is something that I say I had to hold my nose to vote for because it doesn't cut enough. It doesn't reform enough. It doesn't meet the moment that I think is needed. But it is dramatically better than I would have ever expected this ridiculously pathetic Congress to achieve. That's the line, right? We got Inflation Reduction Act changes that cemented, actually made clear that we would not have any more new subsidies, new projects, or anything going forward. But we didn't do anything about existing projects. On Medicaid, we got almost $1 trillion worth of reforms. Medicaid work requirements, we pulled forward to 26 instead of 29. But we didn't get what I wanted, which was the core reforms to the engine of the money laundering and the schemes that blue states have used. And we just overall didn't get the overall front year numbers down enough. So we will have deficits in the first few years. That's not good enough. So that was the balance. I had to weigh all that. I voted for it to move it forward, but we need to improve it in the Senate, in my opinion. Sorry for the long answer.
No, it's a great answer. I think it's an amount of detail our audience needed to hear. I want to talk about the Senate side of things in a minute, and I think I texted you about this morning. There's an interesting phenomenon that occurred yesterday that I noticed with two of the largest MAGA platforms in America, both platforming people that, as of right now, are senators saying they're going to vote against this bill. All right, so I want to get your take on that in a minute, but let's stick with what happened on the House side. And trying to put together something that this level of randomness in your caucus could, with this short of a majority, could actually vote for. My understanding, and I want to make sure my math is right, that I told my audience correctly, what I call they call themselves the Main Street Caucus. I basically call them the Bill Kristol Caucus, all right? That there's like 3 to 4 times more members of that than there are in the Freedom Caucus. Am I accurate where that's concerned, Chip?
Yeah, we don't really publish lists, but I think that is a fair estimate. I think that's probably right. It's certainly 2 to 1. Let's at least say it's 2 to 1.
It's at least 2 to 1. I mean, how can two, walk arm in arm unless they see eye to eye, brother? I'm not saying they're not communists like Democrats are, but they're like this in between ether that, frankly, audiences like mine and people like you, we don't have much more in common with them than we do Democrats. I mean, it seems like maybe their biggest argument with Democrats is what's the rate of self-destruction of the country and the motivation for it. All right, in their case, maybe it's just good old-fashioned corporate grift, and Democrats are just, Soviets trying to retcon history. Okay, but how do you form a governing caucus with people who fundamentally just don't share our value system, yet you're in the same party? How does that work?
Yeah, therein lies some of the difficulty, right? I've got good friends across the entirety of the conference, including those that are on the other ideological end, right? We get along, and there's a lot of things that we see eye to eye on, and we work together on. And I'm happy to do it, right? They're elected by their constituents. That's my job. I have to go figure it out. To quote Rumsfeld, right? You go to war with the army you got. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to do that, but it is difficult. So let me give you an example. When we were working, let's put all the issues aside about deficits, Medicaid, there's so many complexities in the bill. Just focus on the Inflation Reduction Act for a minute. The bill that we got through the committees, that would have allowed projects to continue to get started, new wind and solar projects, which, by the way, make our grid less reliable, empower China, make it difficult to get gas and nuclear plants created, drive up the price of energy. So those things we're going to be allowed to continue, and all the way through 2031 with a 10-year runway and all sorts of there's phase outs, and then we've been able to have projects going well out into the 30s and into potentially the 40s. So we thought that was a failure. We thought that CBO's score then was off because the savings wouldn't materialize because a lot of those projects would continue. Mm-hmm. So when we voted against the budget, remember all the drama like 10 days ago or 2 weeks, whatever that was, 2 weeks ago, when we voted against the budget, then we were able to negotiate to require that we get those changes to the Inflation Reduction Act, which made it more permanent. That means we cut it off. We cut off this, and we say everything has to be online by 28. Now, our friends on the left side of the conference, their heads were exploding. Seriously, so mad. Gosh, we're going to hurt all of these projects, and they're so important in our districts and all these things. And then when we were arguing to say, guys, there's still $400 billion worth of subsidies in ongoing, already attached projects, already existing wind farms and solar farms. And they said, yeah, but Chip, if we cut those, we'll lose jobs. As if you can't have jobs for gas plants, or you can't have jobs for nuclear plants. It's crazy. They're happy to weaken our grid in pursuit of the Green New Scam, even though they campaigned against the Green New Scam, because they take the lowest common political parochial approach. That's the problem that we're dealing with.
Events of the last couple of days, as a chain of events, and maybe they're random. You tell me what you think. Elon Musk tweets out, "I did my best, I tried." Okay. And lets it be known he is stepping aside, as the head of Doge. And then we see the Marjorie Taylor Greene. I first saw this from her right as I was going on the air yesterday, that she had seen a piece of draft legislation from the White House to head to your chamber to codify the Doge cuts. And then there's a story on Fox News yesterday afternoon announcing that the White House is sending those cuts over you guys' way to try to codify these in a separate bill. And maybe probably the two biggest shows, both with people I know and like quite a bit, by the way, two biggest shows in MAGA world have platformed on the same day Republican senators Rick Scott and Ron Johnson, who are both opposed to the bill and actually use their appearances to explain why they are opposed to the bill. What's your analysis of those three events? Do you think they're just organic because in response to where we are politically, or do you think that it's a series of events that are unfolding? Is there an attempt here, in other words, to use the Senate? Are we attempting to jujitsu the Senate to see if we can get something actually better out of the Senate than what you guys passed? So when you go to conference committee, maybe we can get a better version of the big, beautiful bill. What do you think?
Well, very clearly, the Senate has a similar dynamic to the House in that if there are 4 members of the Republican conference who say they don't like the bill, then the bill is dead. Mm-hmm. So that's the simple reality, right? But it will take 4. And you've mentioned, obviously, Rick Scott, and you mentioned Ron John. Rand Paul is obviously already strongly opposed to the bill for a variety of reasons. Mike Lee has expressed reservations, but there are probably another dozen members that have expressed concerns, some on opposite flanks. Right? Susan Collins, Josh Hawley's expressed concerns about Medicaid, I think for the wrong reasons. But if you're whipping the bill, that's the math that they're trying to figure out. So now let's talk about Doge for a minute as one of the elements. And we're talking about Elon. First of all, Elon deserves enormous credit for going into the belly of the beast, setting up shop in an office, sleeping there overnight, working hard, identifying so much of the stuff that we all knew, or at least some of which we knew, but then was able to expose it with a big megaphone and give us a lot more power to try to make changes. And I think they did that effectively. And I agree with Elon. The big, beautiful bill doesn't do enough. We need to cut more. We need to be more aggressive on Doge cuts and everything else. But let me put a little perspective here. Most of the Doge type cuts are either executive action of things they're doing already, or if you want to codify them, they're mostly discretionary stuff, right? They're mostly things that you do through your regular annual appropriations process, not as much through reconciliation. So we've now got to marry all this together to determine whether we can get to the spending levels that we think are appropriate. So now enter, to your question, Rick Scott, Ron Johnson, Mike, the Freedom Caucus. We're continuing to message. We believe we need to do more. And so that means either reforms to Medicaid and the other things that we're touching with, IRA being more fully, completely, totally terminated, as President Trump called on. By the way, the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, others, deputies over at the Energy Department, they've all called on it to be terminated. There are ways we can continue to save money and achieve what we want to achieve, but then also achieve Doge. Now to the last point. So yes, the White House is going to send up a rescissions package next week. Mm-hmm. It's a package we've known about for quite a long time. They've been working on it because they've got to work through a lot of the legalities and the technicalities of how it occurs. Everybody thinks this is just come in and immediately do it. No, you've got to get it done right. And you got to have the votes. Because if we try to rescind it and we fail, we limit the tools of the executive branch to do what they're doing executively. Mm-hmm. So I'm in favor of the rescissions package. We should vote on it, but understand that if we do our level best and we move through 10 billion, 20 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion, 200 billion of rescissions, that's still pretty small in the grand scheme of a roughly $86 trillion spend over the next, 10 years in total government spending.
I've got 2 minutes. Last question I want to ask you is, talking about this just on my own on the show yesterday. To me, the dilemma, if I were in your shoes, is how much better of a deal do I think I can get if this thing loses? Compared to what would that do to the president's political capital globally? He's trying to negotiate deals on trade. He's trying to negotiate deals on Iran and nukes. He's trying to negotiate deals with Ukraine and Russia, right? And so he's got to look strong in order to get the best possible deal on behalf of the American people on numerous global fronts. So what's the choke point where I think I got the best deal I can get because I don't want to unintentionally weaken the president and his political capital on a myriad of other issues at the same time, which is what would happen if a signature piece of domestic legislation went down. That I would be wrestling with that in you guys' shoes. Is that an accurate description of any form of dilemma that you've maybe thought about and senators are thinking right now?
Yeah, for sure. That weighed heavily on my mind last week. The President of the United States was asking us to deliver the bill as we had negotiated it. It fell short of what I wanted, but we had achieved massive victories on the Inflation Reduction Act and on Medicaid. I cannot overstate, those were massive victories. It's just that we know the state of our country. We need to be doing more, right, to meet the moment. So that's what you and I and most conservatives are looking at, including DOGE stuff. But we want to work with the president, who is doing a great job on so many fronts. We want to support him against these activist judges. We want to support him in his quest to stabilize our position in the world through tariffs and through our military, peace through strength. And those kinds of things are what we're all working together in tandem for doing. By the way, we're doing a lot of that. Right? We're doing things we would never have ordinarily done. We've got defense spending and border spending in the mandatory package. We're working collaboratively with them to get this done. The White House is working and responding with us. We're working together. It's actually pretty beautiful, but we've got a little bit more to do to break down these vestiges of your big spending establishment Republicans who have a stranglehold of the congressional Republican Party. That's the normal fight. We're doing it. We're trying to lock arms with the president to get it done. But we got a little more to do, in my opinion. I don't know the right. It's art, not science, Steve. You got to know it when you see it. Yep. I thought we moved the ball and we needed to plant the flag, get it to the Senate. Now the Senate will work. And is it good enough when it comes back? I don't know. We'll see. But if they backslide on the IRA, I'm going to be out. If they backslide on some of the stuff that we accomplished, I'll be out. We need to move the ball forward, not backward.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate you. Good to see you.
Thanks, Steve. God bless.
You bet. Same to you. All right, gentlemen, what do you think?
Man, hear Chip Roy just go down numerically and getting more and more tax cuts and still ultimately saying it's still the best we can hope for is such a minor fraction of the totality of this bill and spending in general. I think it speaks to what you said yesterday, Steve, that the people are the problem. Mm-hmm. Here, no matter how passionately and how hard they fight up there, as long as there's a disconnect in the American people of its level of importance and how much they want to get it done, Chip's right. You simply at the end of the day have to balance a level of reality that people who are tuned into this show often find unacceptable. We find unacceptable, but right now the modern man just has his focus and attention in a lot of other places than the survival of the nation, fiscally or otherwise.
Aaron?
What you just said is kind of a more drawn out or meat on the bones way of saying what I've always said, which is your congressmen, your elected representatives are always reflections of the people that put them in office. They are not aberrations. In the case of Congressman Roy, that's a positive reflection. In the case of most people in Congress, it's a negative reflection of the people who sent them there. And that's just the reality. Yep. And until that changes, Congress is going to be stuck in this quagmire over and over and over again.
Yep. Theology Thursday is next. Stay tuned. And we are back here with Hour 2, live and on demand on Blaze TV, radio, and podcast with Aaron McIntyre and Todders, and I'm Steve Deace. And you can let us know what you think about what we think via the stevedeace.com inbox by emailing us, steve@stevedeace.com. That's DEACE. Like us on Facebook, MeWe, and Gab. You can follow me at Steve Deace Show on X, Instagram, and TikTok. Don't forget to subscribe, please, to our new YouTube channel, which we shouldn't need, but we do, because they deceptively and demonically censored us for several years when we were trying to get the most life-saving information out to as many of you as we possibly could, of course. So we had to start all over again at Deace Show on YouTube. That's at Deace Show on YouTube. And then finally, if you love the program and partake of the podcast version, thank you. Please consider subscribing or hitting follow on Apple iTunes. And that way, every time we do a new episode, it's there in your feed every single time. You can also, if you love the show and haven't done this yet, leave us a 5-star review. Tens of thousands of you have. We appreciate each and every one, and thank you if you're going to add yours today. In fact, we also want to thank our friends over at Farmer Bills. They're concerned about a recent study that showed up to 90% of Americans are not hitting their daily protein threshold. Well, since protein is basically the building block of the human body. That's a problem. So if you are a part of the Steve Deace Show, you've got to be hitting your protein goals as well. But it can be tough if you're on the go and you're working hard. Well, Farmer Bill has your back. And for a limited time, he's increasing the discount to 20% off just for you. Boost your metabolism, stay full longer, hit your protein goals with his air-dried beef biltong. You've seen all the labels of the beef jerky out there. Ingredients you can't pronounce, lab chemicals. Well, Farmer Bill, he's just like you. He's America first. So the beef is American. The ingredients are clean. His meat stacks cured with sea salt, apple cider vinegar, herbs, and spices. They taste great, by the way. You can grab yours today with this limited time offer of 20% off with the new code STEVE20. I recommend the bestseller bundle, and I really like the spicy chili. That's the one I tried. I thought it was very good. All right, so use the code STEVE20 to get yours today. Code STEVE20 at farmerbillsprovisions.com. farmerbillsprovisions.com. Use the code STEVE20 at farmerbillsprovisions.com to get 20% off. The rest of the hour we devote to Theology Thursday, and we are in, I think, one of the most soaring chapters in all of the scriptures. And it will continue to ascend until we get to the very last line or two when it hits a crescendo here at the end of chapter 8. And in the midst of a lot of really hardcore theological analysis, a lot of really sobering cultural analysis now of what it's going to mean now. Buckle in, right? Romans could be subtitled, not going anywhere for a while. Okay, grab a Romans, all right? We're not going anywhere for a while here, all right? This first generation really thought Jesus was coming back like right away, all right, and finishing this thing. And they're beginning to figure out now, a few decades into this, at the very least, it's not going to operate on the expedited timetable they were anticipating. And in fact, they're going to have to learn how to live together now, Jew and Gentile, in the same religious assembly for the first time in all of prophetic history, right? And so there's a lot of sobering discussion and analysis, but this chapter right in the middle of it, I talked for years before we did this book that there's almost a rhythm to the book of Romans when you read it. It's almost a rhythm of, sick 'em, Paul, to, oh, shoot. That was a shot across the bow.
Stop
right?
sicking on me.
Yeah, that's right. I meant go get them. I'm good. Go get them. I'm on Team J, okay? No, that's not how this works, right? So like right in the middle of the book, there's 16 chapters. And right in the middle of the book here is chapter 8, where the full scope of really the challenge of all of human existence is laid out. And so last week we talked about verses 18 and 19. The requirement of suffering to be a Christian, the willingness to suffer as a requirement of being a believer, and still finding joy in that suffering because of what Paul said in the verses we talked about last week. In verse 18, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed for us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. Talking about the revealing of the church. And as Paul is writing these words, he is not living his Joel Osteen best life now. Paul does not have washboard abs. In fact, he's spending a lot of time emaciated, hungry, shipwrecked, beaten, falsely accused, imprisoned, eventually abandoned, beheaded, spending the last few years of his life under house arrest. Several of the epistles he writes at the end of his ministry, Philippians, Galatians, Colossians, are literally prison letters. And then eventually Nero's had enough of Paul's unwillingness to bend the knee and worship him as God, so he cuts his head off there in Rome. Yeah, when we still had Christian bookstores, I don't remember that being Joel Osteen's model for your best life now. Anybody remember that? Your best life now, subtitled, follow Paul as he follows Christ. That's not what we're talking about. Previous generations did understand what this meant and were taught this, and they were prepared and they were tougher. Notice the order I put those two things in, by the way. They were prepared and they were tougher. They were prepared and they were tougher. People can be lazy. Lava is literally blowing out of Pompeii 2,000 years ago. And we have now fossils of Greeks that were basically like, let's get one last orgy blast in. Can't be bothered. So it's not like they were intrinsically superior to us. They were trained, some of it cultural circumstances. Life was harder in the first century than it is today. That's true. In terms of quality of life, standard of living, life expectancy. But they could be complacent as well. They could get lazy as well. I mean, the stuff that Paul writes in letters like these going after spiritual complacency, he is originally writing this to a first century audience who is daily enduring things that would break us and with all the modern convenience we're used to, would just break us today. So they struggle with the same things, just at different levels. But there was leadership in the church that prepared them for difficulty. So they were ready to endure when it was game on. That's what's lacking in our era. That is what is lacking in our era, is we don't have the critical mass systemic church leadership preparing us to endure. And one of the ways we get prepared is what Paul says right here in the verses we talked about last week. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us, the world that is to come. This is not our home. This isn't even the real world. This is the in-between place. So we pick it up now in verse 20. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from the bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons and the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we therefore wait for it with patience. Elsewhere in the Bible, Paul defines hope as the substance of things hoped for, or faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. So he's kind of channeling that here when he says, now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he already sees. Aaron, you always get the short end of the stick, so we're going to let you go first this week. Go ahead.
So let's just concentrate on verse 20. For the creation, to begin with, for the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. R.C. Sproul writes, the word futility is one of the ugliest words in the English language. Nothing can drive the human being to despair more quickly or deeply than the idea that our pain and labor are mere exercises in futility and utterly meaningless. YouTube, anybody? I'm just kidding. I work hard every day to SEO that thing, and it's just goes nowhere. That's a very small, rather cheap example. I'm just pretending. I'm just playing. What could be worse, Sproul says, than the sentence given to Sisyphus in the Greek myth? Sisyphus, of course, uses all of his energy to push up a gigantic rock to the top of a mountain. But as soon as he gets to the top, the rock falls back to the bottom. Then he has to push it back up to the top again and again forever. He was sentenced to vain labor. Paul's words to the Corinthians stand in contrast to what happens in the myth. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. That is the hope of the gospel, that our pain is not meaningless, our toil is not futile. Every ounce of effort we expend in this world, every tear that falls across our cheek is not meaningless. For the present time, the whole creation has been subjected to the appearance of futility, something which did not occur by vote. It was set by divine decree. The world is filled with pain and suffering, not because God is not good, but because he is good and will not tolerate evil. God has subjected the entire creation to pain and affliction because of our sin. The next time we hurt and become angry with God and shake our fist in his face and ask, why me? We must listen for the reply, why not you? The real question is why God in his grace should store up for us in heaven a glory and blessedness so great that the suffering we endure now is not worthy to be compared with it. I love the last few lines there.
Yes, so do I.
Now, if we are to experience pain and suffering, and we all will to various degrees in everyone's life, that is part of the human condition. You cannot escape that. The people who say that you can, or try to set up systems and matrices to try to escape from that reality, we call them foolish utopians. There will always be pain. There will always be suffering. There will always be unfairness. We will all have our burdens to bear, real ones. It's just a matter of when, not if you're not experiencing one right now, or you don't consider yourself experiencing one right now. But in the midst of those trials and afflictions, if you, believer, are tempted to say, and I know it happens, so I'm not casting aspersions at that very much, but if you are tempted to say, why me? And it'll happen. What are you saying about God? If you believe that you bear his image, and if you are bought with the precious blood of the, what are you saying about God in that moment? Instead of saying, why not me? You're basically saying the same thing that Yuval Noah Harari is saying about existence.
No purpose.
There is no purpose.
Yep.
God has promised you there is always purpose in your pain and suffering. And that's what this verse is getting at. And this passage that you read is getting at. The avoidance of pain. If we set up our lives in such a way that we avoid all pain, conflict, all suffering, what are we also avoiding? We're avoiding the purpose that God has us here for in some way and on some level. You know, I'm sure you could say this, Steve, just looking at your inbox any given week, but I'm reminded of the story of somebody in my close family who, it's been about 17, 18 years ago, underwent some very serious suffering, medical suffering, to the point where he didn't know who he was or when he was. And he was in the midst of training for one career, and it was a good career. It was a ministry-oriented career. And in the midst of that pain, in the midst of that suffering, he could no longer train. He was no longer medically able to do what he wanted to do. But it was in the midst of that trial that people around him, his wife, they discovered, hey, you've got a gift for teaching here. And ever since then, he's been teaching, and he's been really good at it. And he will tell you, my pain had a purpose. My suffering had a purpose. I'm doing what God has put me here to do. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we don't see the resolution like that. And I don't want to make this sound like, hey, I went through pain and I have no idea what the purpose of it was. Because sometimes that is the reality. We might not be able to see it in our lifetimes. But God has promised us that it is not meaningless. It is not purposeless. The people who say that are the ones whose souls, sadly, I believe, have been charred. The ones like Yuval Noah Harari. And that is a dark and bleak picture. And all of us who are made in the image of God, deep, 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 sometimes deeper down, we all know that to be the case. But when we set up our lives in a way that we try to avoid that pain and suffering, in many ways, we are avoiding the way and the reason that God has put us on this planet to begin with. So that's just one verse, but I thought Sproul's analysis, especially towards the end, was very apropos.
Well, leave it to Dr. Sproul, the late, great Dr. Sproul, to highlight the holiness of God, since that's also, by the way, probably his signature theological work was on that very theme, right? And leave it to him to say, essentially, why are you asking why bad things happen to good people?
Yes.
Number one, there aren't any good people.
Yes.
And instead of asking how a loving God would permit people to go to hell, you should actually ask the opposite question, which is, given he is a holy and righteous God, why does he offer grace to absolutely any of us as depraved sinners? Your questions are exactly wrong, is essentially what Sproul is saying there, right? And see, this is, again, why worldview is destiny. Worldview is destiny, all right? That ultimately, your worldview where this starting, I remember when I went to the to Answers in Genesis and went to the Creation Museum to do a show about 12 years ago or so. Ken Ham invited me out there when I was with Salem before you guys came to work here, and we went out there and did a live show from the Creation Museum with him and his team. And I kept asking them, contrarian questions from a mainstream scientific perspective, and how they would answer this and how they would answer that and how would they answer this and how would they answer that. And one thing that kept being said to me over and over again is, you are asking questions as if the disagreement is science, and it's not. The disagreement is over worldview, because the worldview determines the assumptions that we are starting with that we will then analyze the science. Right? You've heard me say that there's no such thing as an objective algorithm. It cannot create itself. There has to be a creator, right? All right. So therefore, if there's a creator, there are assumptions. Things cannot create themselves. They don't spontaneously create. It's one of the laws of thermodynamics. You can't bring something forth out of nothing. All right. So life had to start from somewhere and with something. All right. And so therefore, you start with the assumption that it is completely and totally random. You mentioned Yuval Harari. He is starting with that assumption. And notice that he is starting with that assumption and then immediately going to the conclusion, therefore, I can do whatever I want with the glands, hormones, and nerve centers of my body. Because ultimately, there are no purposes. There's just causes. There's no purpose to anything. So therefore, if there's no purpose, there's no judge. There's no morality. Or you start with the assumption that life begins with God. Those are your two assumptions, the old James Dobson line. God is or he ain't. Those are your two options. God is or he isn't, We're all looking at the same data. We're just drawing different conclusions on the basis of our assumptions. You cannot come to the conclusions that Sproul is articulating without faith in God. You can't do it. It's not possible. The best you'll be able to do is what Ayn Rand did, which is, hey, I really enjoy being a chain-smoking moral degenerate, but I have to acknowledge for the sake of my own sanity that there are objective truths in the world. So in order to justify my chain-smoking moral degeneracy, I'll come up with objectivism, which says a lot of the same things that natural law and common grace that come out of Christian teaching say, but without any divine accountability at all. That's the best that you can do. This also explains why, on a macro level in our country, everything Aaron just laid out, also explains why on a macro level in our country, why we are the longest concurrent experiment in human freedom in the history of the world. Because we were the first country ever founded. This is Cleon Skousen's 5,000-year leap. 5,000 years of human history recorded, at least. We're the first people that ever began with the notion there is a God and our rights come from him. And therefore government's main purpose to exist is to defend the God-given rights. That's not asserted in anywhere else in the entire arc of human history. That is not asserted until July 2nd, 1776, and then ratified two days later on the 4th. It's the first time ever. It's the first time ever in all of our posterity as humanity that's ever asserted. And then codified and then acted upon on top of that. And then an entire framework of a civilization comes from that mustard seed. Never had happened before. May never happen again, depending how this one ultimately turns out here, heading into year 250 next year. So this has been a worldview battle the entire time. Someone will always rule. Something must always be worshipped. What is it about Trump that makes the other side so insane? What it is about Trump that makes them so insane, and we need to say this too, before there was Trump derangement syndrome, I know if you're Aaron's age or younger maybe, or a Gen Zer, you don't remember this. But Todd, you and I are old enough to remember Palin derangement syndrome. Sure. You and I are old enough to remember Bush derangement syndrome, okay? Yeah. So, now this is something that is not fundamentally different than what we've experienced from leftists for the last generation. All right. Now it's dialed up, as you like to say, Mr. Spinal Tap. Theirs now goes up to 11. Okay. Yeah. But it's the same stereo. It's the same speaker system. It just goes up to 11 now. Okay. But it's been on for a few decades here, folks. the reason why, there's two reasons why they have had these derangement syndromes most of our lives. Or one reason why they've had this derangement syndrome most of our lives, and then one more reason why it's dialed up to 11 under Trump. They've had this because the state is their God. Someone must always rule. Something must always be worshipped. God is government. The state is God. Something must bring order then. If there is no purpose, as Yuval Harari thinks, which is what the spirit of the age leftist in the world also believes, then what do we bring forth as human beings then in order to establish order? If it is not God, and there's no order to the universe, so therefore that's another way of saying no purpose, what other entity would be brought forth then to bring order? What would it be? Government. And so this is why you see a religious level, Maccabean level of zeal. If you know your history of the time between the Testaments, Maccabean level of zeal from today's Democrats and leftists. A level of I can't even dialed up to 11 on top of Antifa beatings and riots. This is why. I mean, every time our side wins, it's like Antiochus Epiphanes takes over the temple and slaughters a pig to Zeus on it. It is an anathema to their religion. This is why we can't live together. This is why we can't coexist. And we're just now beginning to figure this out when they were there 20 years ago. You're a racist, misogynist, a xenophobic, homophobe. Those aren't just terms for flourish. They believe this about you. You cannot be tolerated. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. They've got their own dogmas too. Now, the reason it's dialed up to 11 with Trump is because Trump's not a conventional conservative. And so this idea of I have to self-edit, I have to self-diminish myself, I can't use the power that's been granted to me in ways that would go against my stated ideology or orthodoxy or doxology, so I'm not some kind of a hypocrite. This is why the David Frenches of the world hate Trump's guts. Because they're Pharisees and they care way more about the unwritten rules than the written ones. Well, along comes this guy who doesn't come out of any of our theology schools and did not go to the Milton Friedman, Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley School of Good Governance. By the way, I love all three of those guys. I did go to that school. I was kind of a C student, but I finished. He didn't come from any of that. And so the reason why the inclination that's been there for decades gets dialed up to 11 with Trump is they see him do things like, yeah, I think we might go ahead and sue CBS News again. George W. Bush, CBS News, and Dan Rather committed libel and slander against George W. Bush on the eve of the 2000 election. Remember this? Yeah. And then Bush ended up winning right away. What did Bush do with the CBS News and Dan Rather after he got power? Not a damn thing. The maximum gentleman you could possibly imagine. Listen, we couldn't get George W. Bush to come out of retirement to help us on any issues the last 20 years. He came out of retirement, though, for the christening of the Michelle and Barack Obama presidential and first lady portrait. He came out of retirement for that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The reason why they're dialed up to 11 with Trump is they see someone that now recognizes and is willing to utilize power. Oh, this guy's going to take and weaponize the power that we weaponized against you. He's going to weaponize it against us. Going to make Dan Bongino deputy director of the FBI. Wait. Marco Rubio was doing Gang of Eight a decade ago. Now Marco Rubio's like, we're going to revoke visas for Chinese nationalists in all our universities. How you like them apples? That's what they're threatened by. The use of power now against them. Because that's the result of a worldview that doesn't account for God. No purpose. Which means there's also no point to suffering. Unless you're making the people you disagree with suffer. We can't rise above our own worldview. Worldview is destiny. Aaron, that was exceedingly well said. After the break, we'll turn it over to Dr. Scott Hahn. In the meantime, Todd, do you want to say anything in response to anything that Aaron and I have said?
Well, the suffering that he starts off, what we've talked about the last 2 weeks, but going back 3 weeks where it ends, the nature of our faith and endurance, that it's always been a sticky wicket, but it speaks as much or more than ever to this particular generation that has the luxury of almost inescapable comfort, which is why the kind of preaching that you should be getting from your Pottery Barn churches, as Steve so rightly points out, is almost as long as any semblance of Pottery Barn can be attached, you're not going to get what you need. That's the point of using that term, which I think is so smart by Steve. It just denotes a kind of cookie cutter comfort that you've defaulted to. That is literally antithetical to the gospel. It doesn't mean that comfort is evil, but it does mean that you have been explicitly told that it in no way is a permanent state of being if you authentically claim yourself Christian.
100%.
I mean, you can't, if you're always comfortable, the whole notion of what Aaron just got done talking about how do you think you somehow get to dance through the raindrops of the label of sinner, the effects of being a sinner, resenting talking about being a sinner? We've got a lot of ways that are very comfortable that we think somehow we are the Barack Obama people we've been waiting for. We actually think we've programmed, you talked about an algorithm at the beginning, Steve. We've programmed our own algorithm that says we're not really as bad as all those other people because we're comfortable.
Both worldviews acknowledge there is suffering in the world. One worldview says suffering is there for a purpose. It is permitted for a purpose. And because there is a purpose, therefore there's an adjudicator that will ultimately, in this life or the next, make you whole for that suffering and or bring it to a halt. The random worldview says, therefore, since there's no purpose, suffering must be avoided at all cost. Well, I get to inflict suffering on you, of course. Well, I'm pregnant and I can't handle having a baby right now, so I get to commit murder. Besides, I don't want the baby. I wouldn't love it the way the baby deserves to be loved anyway. So the most loving thing I could do, because, by the way, if you abandon a child or murder a child, what gets a higher prison sentence? The murder does. But if you do it to your unborn child, murdering your kid as opposed to abandoning your kid is considered the more sane and healthy option. That's insane. If you reject God, it's not. That's why the Bible says the fool says in his heart there is no God. We'll come back. We'll hear from Dr. Scott Hahn here in just a moment. Stay tuned. All right, back here on the Steve Deace Show here on The Blaze, brought to you by our friends over at SelectQuote. They're one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience. They've helped over 2 million customers find over $700 billion with a B, $700 billion in coverage since 1985. You know, other life insurance brokers out there, they may offer you a program that's often impersonal, one-size-fits-all kind of policies, may end up costing you more while covering you less. But SelectQuote's and licensed insurance agents, they work for you to tailor a life insurance policy for your individual needs. And in as little as 15 minutes, you might be concerned about pre-existing conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes. They can help you with those as well. So get the right life insurance for you and for less at SelectQuote.com/Steve. Go to SelectQuote.com/Steve today to get started. That's SelectQuote.com/Steve. Again, go to SelectQuote.com/Steve. And also, don't forget, you can get your copy now. We're down to about 500 and change copies. One-time only offer, full-sized, hardcover, personally autographed, Pride Edition copies of my new book, Richie Meets the Rainbow, which is coming out here in June. For the most demonic time of the year, RichieMeetsTheRainbow.com, RICHIE, is where you can go to get your copy while supplies last today. RichieMeetsTheRainbow.com, RICHIE, for RichieMeetsTheRainbow.com. Trust me, they've wanted us to celebrate Pride Month with them. I think it's time to give them what they want.
Challenge accepted?
Challenge accepted. Your terms are acceptable. Indeed. All right, let's find out what our Catholic cousin over here, Dr. Scott Hahn, thinks through the one and only Todd Erzin. You're up, my friend.
Well, in the past, when we've been talking about eschatology on this show, we all, I remember, had a point where we agreed that it doesn't speak to the rightness or wrongness of pre-mill, but we acknowledge that perhaps one of the psychological and emotional appeals to it is it's the most superhero aspect
we kind of
it.
tap out, and wait for deliverance.
Yeah,
Very
it's cinematic.
Yes.
It's cinematic. I understand. Well, I think, and then more specifically, what I've said about pre-mill. Well, I think the real superhero story is right here. And it's told to us by Paul to help us with this. What? I don't want to suffer. What am I supposed to do about that? Me. Well, he gets you outside of the me into the us by telling you about the greatest story I've ever told. He's going to tell you right now about there's no greater love than he who will lay down his life for his friend, and to get you outside of yourself to understand what's really at stake. Paul personifies creation in order to dramatize its predicament, much as the scriptures of Israel had done. Paul envisions the revelation of the children of God coinciding with a massive renovation of the visible cosmos. The relationship between man and the world is so close that the fate of the one is tied up with the fate of the other. That superhero aspect, think about at the very end of that long walk. We always agreed they can't believe they landed that plane, but they did at the end of Endgame. Mm-hmm. When the Tony Stark of the first movie has become the Tony Stark of the last movie and sacrifices life for his friends. And at the end...
After being told by Captain America, we both know you're not the one to make the sacrifice play.
Yes. And his hologram image that he pre-recorded before his death that he gives to everybody he loves, his young daughter in there. And he's talking like this. He's like, when I got in the business of the superhero game, how could I have thought these cosmic forces of light and dark? This is how you suffer because you understand exactly what it's like. It's not just about you. It's the alpha and the omega, as small as you can think, as big as you can think, and then think way beyond that. That's what this is about. We ourselves groan in unison with creation as we wait for adoption.
Can I pause you right there?
Yeah.
That is verbatim what Spurgeon writes about this section. That exact same language. Right before I read it this morning, that is exactly what Spurgeon writes. I mean, verbatim is that sentence.
I fear we may depart a little bit, but I think it speaks to ultimately why I hope Romans all the way to the end works. Like we got to get on the same page on the fundamentals. This is a football, because here, divine adoption, as Paul describes it, encompasses two events, baptism and bodily resurrection. It has its beginning in the sacrament and awaits its completion at the end of history. The same distinction between present and future benefits is programmed into Paul's description of the Spirit as the first fruits. Here he alludes to the liturgical traditions of Israel. The first fruits were the first stalks of grain gathered from the spring harvest and taken to the temple in Jerusalem. They were offered to the Lord in thanksgiving for a successful beginning and in petition for his blessing on the rest of the harvest season. He uses the logic of this part in advance of the whole to describe the Spirit as a down payment on the full amount of God's blessings to come. So again,
that's exactly what Spurgeon wrote.
Because
Spurgeon said that that the sons of God receiving the Holy Spirit, mirroring the language of Pentecost and the Jewish tradition, as you just mentioned, and Paul comes out of that, that is the down payment of the fulfillment of the. So, are we adopted? Yes. Are we being adopted? Yes. Is the adoption completed? No, that's the process that is undergoing, and that's what it means with he who has begun a good work in you is faithful to complete it until the moment of the moment of completion, right?
And that's why you are suffering, A, and B, that's why suffering not only must be endured for your sake, but for the sake of all creation. You are being asked to play a part beyond what you are worth, and empowered to do so, as Paul talks just in a couple of verses there about how you will be aided in your darkest moments with the prayers that you need, because you have been given the opportunity to participate in this story. It is not one to feel sorry about, it's one to get down on bended knee and say thank you. That is why you suffer.
I think it's important to note the role having the Holy Spirit at work helps us to, is how we can endure. That's how we can endure. This is how we can find joy in our suffering. This is how we can find meaning in our suffering. This is how we can find contentment despite our suffering. Okay? It's a radical transformation. This is the process of what it means. Ultimately, we talked about what it means to be born again. Well, since there's no real process, right? You see a sinner's prayer in a lot of evangelical churches, for example, and that language is taken, liturgically out of what we think the Bible espouses. You guys have your own process of catechesis and confirmation. You liturgically take that out of how you interpret the scriptures mean. We're both trying to figure out what is it that instigates this process? What is it that kind of kicks it into high gear, that jumpstarts this process of conversion? What is it that causes someone to now have a new nature and be different than what they were when they were born a sinner? That is very debatable because there is no definitive process laid out scripturally for exactly what that does or how that works. Instead, what is definitively defined is how it looks once it's happened. So it's not the process by which that this actually is engendered is not explicitly stated, but the process by which you can know it is occurring is explicitly stated. And one of those ways is a willingness to and a successful enduring of suffering. And not becoming bitter and hateful and spiteful in spite of that, but more Christ-like. On the brink of his ultimate suffering, Christ prays for deliverance. Prays, is there a way to avoid this? But then he accepts the cup. Whose cup is that, by the way? Yours. Mine. It's not his. He's tempted and never sins. Not his. It's yours. That's mine. Let this cup pass from me. Whose cup? Yours and mine. Instead, he takes that cup upon himself. By his stripes, by his wounds, we are healed. The purpose of his suffering. And now there is purpose for us in ours. I've told this story before. Can you indulge me if I tell it one more time? The story of how the gladiator games ended in Rome. And a young monk named Telemachus was sent on a dispatch to Rome. While there, he encounters the Colosseum. And he notices a great commotion at the Colosseum. So he wants to see what this is all about. He's heard stories and tales about it. So he decides to go to check it out for himself. Goes in there, and what he sees is savagery, man's inhumanity to man. It's disgusting. It's vile. It's macabre. There's children there. And he begins to yell out in Latin, in the name of Christ, forbear or stop. At first, he can't be heard. He's ignored. Then as the crowd begins to simmer down in between bouts of action, he gets louder. He's more heard. They start to wonder, is he, this little tiny monk, is he maybe our version of the halftime show? Okay. He gets increasingly incensed. He goes down onto the field and screams again to the crowd in Latin, in the name of Christ, forbear or stop. Now the crowd is booing, hissing, laughing at him, mocking him. One of the gladiators comes through with a spear and runs him through in cold blood right there in full view of the people, and it causes an audible gasp. the backlash that occurred within Roman society to that event is why that was the last time ever the gladiator games were held in Rome. The brutal suffering inflicted upon Telemachus ended further suffering of brutality. You see the chain of events here. What does it mean when John says we love because he first loved us? Well, one of the ways we love is we endure as he endured for us. I've said this before. Notice it doesn't say win the race. It says finish the race. The race is already won. Your job is to finish it now. The race is already won. What's Jesus' last words at the cross? What are they? It is finished. It is completed. There's lots of meanings that the wrath of God is finished. The law is fulfilled. There's lots of meanings to that. The race is finished. It is finished. Your race has been won. You now must finish it. We win by finishing. We endure. Trials, difficulties, controversies, confrontations. We don't seek to avoid those things. The gospel does not give us avoidance of those things. I know that a lot of what amounts to Christian television in the last few decades has taught you heretically that is the case, and they were wrong, and they're heretics, and if they don't repent, they will receive double the torment in hell, I believe, since a teacher receives double the honor. But the truth is, ultimately, nothing of significance is achieved in life, period, without some form of suffering. We love the first few words of the Declaration of Independence. We rarely quote the last sentence of it to each other, pledging our lives, fortunes, and sacred honors. That's everything they had. In other words, we give everything we have to this cause, literally everything. All of our wealth, our bodies, our health, everything we have, we pledge to this cause, and several of them paid that cost to the hilt, so that we could be here and determine sour cream and onion or barbecue chips at the cookout here just this July 4th.
Yeah,
okay?
Exactly.
Nothing happens without any form of suffering, of meaning in your life. Nothing does. Arguably the greatest athlete of our times, Michael Jordan. What's the famous story about him? Got cut from his 8th grade basketball team, right? If he doesn't respond to that, is he ever really the Michael Jordan that we know? Probably not. To the point that now, and this is what happens when, again, you lack that divine purpose, to the point that when he was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame, he still called out that 8th grade coach by name and still had that amount of built-in spite for cutting him. Used it as motivation for his entire life. So you can turn this into idolatry too without the fruit of the Spirit in your life. But there is nothing to be achieved of any value without some form of suffering. We see it in our wives, men. It's amazing. At the time they're giving birth to our children, the things they say to us and think about us are not nice. All right? And you're like, I can't ever put my wife through that again. You ever notice, though, your wife will often come back to you a year or two later and say, hey, don't you think we should have another baby? Have another kid? And you notice a lot of that pain and misery your wife goes through to deliver that kid, how it almost instantly evaporates when she gets to hold that child. Purpose fulfilled. That's why. The suffering was worth it. I see now why. You were made to do more than pursue leisure, as Todd says. He's right about that. I love leisure, man. Hey, during the break, man, I was checking out the first few weeks of the football schedule this fall. I also work 16 hours a day. Between what I do for this, what I do for the family, what I do for my wife, what I do for other causes that people ask me for help with. I take about 2 hours a night on my own after everybody goes to bed to wind down, and then go to bed and get up and do it again. There's nothing wrong with having pursuits of leisure. They cannot, though, be a way of life. They cannot be the defining mechanism and metric by which we determine ourselves.
You cannot live to escape. You
Correct.
can escape to live, but you cannot live to escape.
A buddy of mine sent me a podcast with Theo Vaughn and Mike Rowe from about a month ago, and I listened to it today. Mike Rowe said he did a study that found there's at least 7 million young men that aren't even in the workforce. Able-bodied, not even seeking work. And he said, he read the study, he said, and he said after he got done reading, what are they doing then? Most of them are just on their screens. That's no way to live. That's a prison. If you go to Universal or Disney once a year, once every few years, it seems like a great vacation and trip, right? What if you went every day? Wouldn't you get boring after a while? Wouldn't you be like, wait, I've done the Hogwarts ride 70 times now. What's the point? There's nothing of significance there, ultimately. Except for the effort that it took for you to save to go on that trip, the people that you took with you on this special event so you could share it together, the pictures and videos you guys took of each other while you were there. It's the memories that matter way more than the experience. These are things every previous generation of this country took for granted, that this generation has to be taught. Because it's not being taught in our families, and it sure as heck is not being taught in our churches. It is not being taught in our Todd Pottery Barn McChurches. It just simply is not. And so, frankly, it's up to shows like this to then fill in the gap, to do their job for them. Great discussion, guys.
Yep.
We're going to stick around and do overtime for Blaze TV subscribers. For the rest of you, we'll see you tomorrow, noon to 2 Eastern, right after Glenn Beck, and right here on Blaze TV. Until then, Romans 8:28.